I'm going to sort of talk to you about agroecology and autonomy in European peripheries, and specifically my fieldwork has been in Cornwall and Calabria. So I'm looking at what kinds of agroecology are emerging in these peripheral regions, and I'm using the concept of autonomy as a lens to look at that, and particularly asking what kinds of autonomy do these farmers have, and what kinds of autonomy are they sort of struggling for. And my starting point, before I go on to there, just to sort of say it's kind of a summary of my thesis. So as I said before, I'm going to be handing in about 2 months. So there's still a bunch of issues I'm working through. There's still lots of sort of details which I'm trying to sort of link up the dots and things. So any sort of comments and discussion afterwards would be useful. And for that reason, I'll try not to talk for more than sort of half an hour or so that there is a bit of time for discussion afterwards. So my starting point really is sort of Mark Tilsey's work. So this is a picture of the cover of his book, Political Ecology, Food Regimes and Food Sovereignty. And I follow a lot of his sort of political ecological framing, but I won't go into detail of that. The part of the argument which is really relevant here is Mark argues that radical forms of agroecology are more likely to emerge in the global south. And Mark can correct me if I make a mistake in summarizing his arguments here. But more or less, under neoliberalism, you have the sort of rise and dominance of financial and transnational capital in core countries and regions in the world. But that dominance isn't total in the way that it sort of appears to be in, say, Hart and Negri's work. Instead, states remain important as mediators of domestic class relations. But overall, this sort of you end up with these financial and transnational capitals shaping the world economy in ways that suit their own interests. And in particular, that structures the world system in a way where you get people in the global south and economies in the global south are integrated into the world system as producers of sort of cheap goods, cheap food, cheap manufactures for the global north. And so then people in the global north are incorporated into the system primarily as consumers. And through that process, along with the presence of a lot of sort of state subsidies and welfare systems in the global north, capitalism and states have a lot more legitimacy in places like Europe and North America, by contrast with those in the global south, which lack strong legitimacy. And because of that, you get the sort of differentiation of different kinds of opposition to hegemony. And in particular, the sort of these two gradations, you have sort of alter-hegemonic or progressive oppositions, which is what you find in the global north. You sort of get alternative food networks, and they're opposed to the idea of supermarket and corporate-led food systems. But apart from that, they're quite happy to sort of work through markets, be market-oriented in their production and sort of market-dependent. By contrast, what you get in the global south are these much more counter-hegemonic forms of resistance, which are more fundamentally anti-capitalist. They're about getting access to land, particularly in kind of sort of commons or anti-private property forms, and they advance stronger forms of cooperation. So within that kind of context, my question is, well, what about the sort of core periphery structurings where within the global north, and here in particular within Europe? So there's a growing body of work which is talking about the presence of agroecology in Europe, particularly people like Jan Douwe van der Ploeg, Alexander Wessel, and others. But these discussions haven't really looked at and considered about the internal divisions in Europe. And there's a lot of different divisions that are worth mentioning there. For example, I mean, you've got the sort of the West versus the former Soviet countries. You've got the sort of northern industrial powerhouses versus your sort of Mediterranean South. And a lot of these divisions have been particularly made worse, I suppose, since in the last 10 years since the Eurozone crisis and so on and so forth. And so what you get within Europe is you have a lot of marginalized regions which are characterized by a similar set of integrations into the European system, which is similar to what we see on the sort of global scale, the global south. So you get a lot of surplus transfers coming from these marginal regions into the core. You get coercive policy impositions on marginal regions. You get limited degrees of self-determination and political devolution, and sort of lower levels of state legitimacy. And so particularly that's what contextualizes my study is looking at how Cornwall and Calabria are peripheralized in these ways, and how that sort of shapes the kinds of agroecology that are emerging. And to do that, I'm looking at this concept of autonomy. And here sort of autonomy sort of really starts out becoming significant in agroecology because of Jan Douwe van der Ploeg's 2008 book, The New Peasantries, in which he sort of equates the peasant condition as a struggle for autonomy. And this sort of use of autonomy based on that work has become sort of increasingly prominent in the agroecological literature. But I think it's generally not really teased out theoretically very well. One of the interesting areas where that discussion has gone is again, Mark Tilsey has commented on this, is a critical view which sort of says there are certain neoliberal or false kinds of autonomy much more grounded in individualism and market competition versus an actual autonomy which is grounded in more sort of radical cooperation and farmers working together to resist the sort of structures such as capitalism which govern them. Within this, there's also a distinction which is really made between political and technical kinds of autonomy. And so political autonomy is really about self-determination and freedom, whereas technical autonomy is more the kind of technical aspects of agroecological practice, which sort of replace inputs with sort of internal systems and internal ecological processes, and really sort of concentrate on an internal circulation of nutrients and energy within agroecosystems. There's an implicit idea then in van der Ploeg's work and a lot of other people's work that if you achieve this technical autonomy through agroecological practice, you somehow attain the political autonomy of self-determination and freedom. And while I think there are good reasons and good arguments for that, my point is to make it explicit so that we can sort of really bring it into question a bit more. And then on top of that, you've also got sort of a much wider body of philosophical work, and this is what James was saying, you know, my background, I studied philosophy in my undergraduate degree. So you've got this much wider body of literature which talks about autonomy. And so there's a whole bunch of different philosophical approaches that I'm trying to bring into the discussion without hopefully getting too sort of lost in some of the sort of abstract thinking. And this is a book here which has been influential. This is Relational Autonomy, which is a series of essays coming from feminist political philosophy, which talks about the kind of autonomy of individuals, but in a sense where the individual is not a kind of masculine, self-sufficient logic, which often appears in discussions of autonomy, but is more embedded in social relations. And so a lot of these sort of philosophical perspectives, you know, raise a lot of interesting questions which do get discussed in the agroecological literature. And part of that is really, the first question has to be sort of whose agency and whose autonomy are we actually dealing with? And so there's, and my focus here really is on human individuals, and particularly in terms of farmers. But there are other approaches in agroecology which sort of consider the autonomy of collectives or communities, and particularly sort of indigenous cultures. And also ideas of the self which subordinate the individual to being part of a wider ecology. And so this sort of picture here is a series of essays about Matauranga Māori, which is sort of the indigenous philosophy of the Māori people in New Zealand. And that sort of, you know, particularly there are certain ideas there, such as whakapapa, which really connect individuals in with place and with a sort of much tighter sense of community. So if you were to talk about autonomy in that context, it would be quite different to that if you're simply talking about the autonomy of individual farmers. Then there's also the question of, okay, autonomy in relation to what? And so one of the things that agroecology raises is this sort of modernist idea of humans being autonomous of nature really needs to be brought into question. then there's this possibility of autonomy between agents or between individuals, which is a logic which is present among a lot of farmers, particularly sort of European and British farmers, where you have this sort of narrative of individualism and again, bringing in this masculine self-sufficiency idea. I want to be independent of any other people. I can do this on my own, this kind of idea. But then where I sit, and again, I think sort of, Mark Tilsley's sort of idea of actual autonomy sits in this idea of agents versus structure. So it's really about sort of how are agents able to sort of be autonomous in respect of structures such as capitalism and a market and so on and so forth. And that focus then on agents and structures brings me to this critical realist model of the relationship between agency and social structure. And particularly this is the work of Roy Bhaskar and his transformational model of social activity. And we can sort of divide the discussion into two parts. On the left-hand side of the slide here, you see the processes by which social structure influence agents. And so one of the aspects of that is a process of socialization where the kinds of people we are, let's talk about farmers. So farmers' desires, farmers' ways of thinking are shaped by the social context in which they're born, grow up in, live in, so on and so forth. And so this idea of a sort of relational autonomy or relational self-determination is really about how you're socialized in a way which maximizes your autonomy. But then following on from that, the social structure also enables and constrains the ability of agents to act. And so there, if we think about something like capitalism, that structures who gets access to land and what they're able to do with it and so on and so forth. So you get the sort of social structure shapes the desires and the wills and the ways of thinking of agents, but then it also controls their ability to act subsequently. And then on the right-hand side, you then get the sort of, okay, well, what can agents do about the social structure? How does agents' behavior either reproduce or transform the social structure? And here then this idea, particularly a Marxist idea of freedom and emancipation, is the idea that agents can somehow exercise conscious control over social structure. So reproduction and transformation is not something that just happens, but can be controlled either through the formation of collective rationalities or the building of democratic institutions. So this, I apologize, this is very abstract, but the idea, you can already start to see two different ideas of autonomy here. On the left-hand side, you've got something which more addresses a sort of idea of personal freedom of the agent in respect of the social structure. And then on the right-hand side, you've got this capacity of the agent to exercise control over their structural conditions. So then turning kind of a bit more to agroecology, specifically the kinds of structures that matter, I would say, can be broadly divided into four. These are markets, states, personal relations, and nature. And this is, of course, oversimplification, and there are lots of different types of markets, there are different types of states, there are different types of personal relations, and so on. But broadly, I would argue that a more agroecological idea of autonomy involves subordinating oneself to nature and subordinating oneself to personal relations in order to evade the kind of impositions of markets in the state. And there's also to create a position from which you can exercise more influence over markets and states as well. And that's sort of the basis of a more radical kind of agroecology, maybe is when you're much more subordinated to nature and much more subordinated to personal relations. And I'm thinking there's something like, the embedded or nested markets where markets are not just about, buying and selling and profits and things, but actually you're selling for specific individuals and you're providing food for specific individuals is an example of becoming more subordinate to personal relations. And likewise, sort of a move to self-sufficiency and sort of being able to produce food within the sort of specific ecological context that you're within would constitute a kind of subordination to nature. So then, so that's kind of my sort of theoretical outline, and my study methodology really has been a sort of a comparative study of what you might call proto-agroecological farms in Cornwall and Calabria. And so these are farms which are practicing sort of ecological alternative forms of farming, things like biodynamic or organic or so on and so forth. Not very many farms in these regions identify themselves as agroecological, although it is a kind of a narrative which is starting to emerge. But on a conceptual level, I'm a little bit hesitant to follow Mark Tilsey and other people's work where you sort of say this is a real autonomy and all these other kinds of autonomy are false. Instead, I'm taking this ecology of social action approach, which kind of asks, well, what kinds of autonomy or what kinds of social behaviours might emerge in certain contexts? And the reason there's a picture of Darwin there is because this idea developed by Paul McLaughlin that really sort of draws on a sort of frame variant and population way of thinking about social processes to do that. So that's kind of the way I'm thinking, is sort of saying, what kinds of autonomy are emerging in particular places and how are they shaped by their particular contexts. At the same time, following this critical realist sort of structure agency framework, I'm also making use of abduction and retroduction. So abduction is the sort of process whereby you take a new interpretation or a new set of theoretical ideas and ask, how does that sort of help us to reinterpret or re-understand certain processes? So I'm bringing this idea of autonomy into the discussion of agrarian change and saying, what does that reveal that we didn't already know? But then also this retroductive process whereby you work with a whole bunch of specific empirical information and you sort of start to build back to the abstract from that. And that's really about sort of saying, well, okay, this is what farmers are doing, this is how they justify it, what does that tell us about the autonomy that they have and that they're struggling for? So in more practical terms, I did interviews with about 50 farms, which amounted to just over 72 sort of people involved in those farms. And the numbers are a little bit high there, in part because of a couple of intentional communities in Cornwall where I sort of spoke with about sort of 6 or 7 people on each farm. But part of the process was also speaking to multiple people on farms. So I might speak with a husband and a wife working on the same farm to try and get an idea of some of the intra-household dynamics in terms of autonomy as well. So I'm going to jump now into discussing sort of some of the similarities and variations between my two sort of sample groups in each region. One of the things which really immediately jumped out was a lot of the farmers, are migrants. And there were sort of more stable farms, but actually the sort of amongst this alternative group of farms, there was a lot more sort of instability. And in Cornwall, the migration was inward. So the people I'm talking to are predominantly not from Cornwall, but have come from other jobs, perhaps living in London, working in the city in a couple of cases, which means that their access to land in Cornwall is really through purchasing. So they've sort of bought small farms and so on and so forth. By contrast, in Calabria, you get a lot more return migration. So you've got people who are from Calabria, but they've maybe lived and worked in the north of Italy or abroad, or they have worked as lawyers or professionals in some other capacity. But then they've come back to be able to access sort of family land a lot more, which creates its own sort of dynamics in terms of land access, but in some respects is a lot easier. You also have in Calabria this big sort of phenomenon of abandoned land, which sort of contextualized by sort of long histories of sort of devaluing agricultural production and things, and historic migration to the north of Italy and things. But that also shapes how people access land. So there's this idea of comodato d'uso gratuito, or sort of a form of free tenure, basically, where you can get a formalized tenancy on a piece of land, maybe for 20 years, can be quite long term, without paying anything in return. Or often there are informal kind of arrangements where you might sort of give a share of the olive oil or something that you produce from the land, and so on and so forth. Overall, however, there's generally a sense that all of the farms in my sample were quite market-oriented. There's arguably in Calabria a higher degree of self-provisioning, and that's linked to a kind of presence of more mixed farming. So farms in Calabria tend to integrate sort of some grains, some horticulture, and some animals together on the same farm. Whereas by contrast in Cornwall, you have a much more explicit division between market gardening and extensive livestock production. So those are kind of the specialist areas. And when you specialize in those kinds of ways, your possibilities of self-provisioning are much narrower and much more limited. Another interesting point of difference is the kinds of markets that these farms are selling into. So in Cornwall, almost all of these farms tend to be selling very locally, particularly true for the market gardeners. But that localization of food production, localization of food marketing is really only possible because of the really, really strong tourist sector in Cornwall. And so that sector coincides, or the seasonality of the tourism sector coincides with the seasonality of market gardening, and so it works to create a kind of local food system, although it's a little bit illusory because it's still oriented to serving people from outside the region in a way. By contrast, in Calabria, you don't have such a strong tourism system, and most of the farmers in my sample were tending to sell to national or European markets. They were doing so, however, still through direct sets of relations, avoiding sort of wholesalers and things, and particularly these solidarity purchasing groups, or gruppi d'acquisto solidale, were very prominent, but they're a really interesting example. So these purchasing groups basically are groups of consumers who come together and sort of have an agreement with a farmer to buy certain amounts of produce every week, or so on and so forth. So it bears some resemblance in terms of providing more security to farmers, bears some resemblance to kind of community-supported agriculture in some ways. But what's noteworthy about these is in Calabria, there are far fewer of these groups than there are in the north of Italy. So that's sort of an interesting aspect of the peripheralization and the integration between these alternative markets and having rich consumers basically available to sort of purchase your produce. And then the other thing, perhaps one of the more interesting areas, albeit more marginal, were these kinds of non-family forms of farming. And in Cornwall, you had a sort of couple of intentional communities and a couple of community agricultural projects, which really sort of shaped the way land and labour were integrated in quite radical and different ways. Still with a lot of aspects of commoditisation, however. At the same time, in Calabria, you tended to have a large number of sort of group farms or projects where you had a group of friends coming together to sort of restore or take on abandoned land and bring it back into production. You also had these sort of educational and social agricultural projects, which these have sort of specific legal status in Italy, but basically they do farming, but then they serve these other sort of social functions as well, which also creates a number of interesting dynamics. So out of all of that, and I mean, something that I'm really struggling with at the moment is you have huge diversity across all these farms. So I'm trying to make generalizations as best I can. But you end up, some farms mobilize much more radical discourses than others. Some are much more radically self-sufficient than others. Some are cooperating more radically than others. So trying to generalize in that context is quite difficult. But what I would say is all of these farms are mobilizing narratives of difference and resistance in a way. And particularly, you get people talking about traditional farming, you get people talking about ecology and community and wanting to work within those kinds of logics. But at the same time, you have this ideology of markets as being the way to deliver most of those processes. So if you think, farmers might say, well, I want to feed my local community, or I want to create work for people. They do that through sort of market relations. They want to employ someone, they want to sell their food, and so on and so forth. And so through all of this process, you end up with a kind of quite a partial degree of self-sufficiency and quite a partial nature of cooperation. I would say it's maybe on balance a little bit more radical in Calabria, but it's hard to make that kind of judgment. And one of the biggest barriers I think these farmers face is an inability to integrate more labour into their farming systems. And that's kind of, a common refrain is we don't have enough money to hire more people. Or there's also sort of narratives like people don't want to work in farming, which is a very familiar one. And this sort of creates a problem really for agroecology, because if you think about sort of how agroecology is supposed to work in terms of much more labour intensive, low input farming, if you can't integrate more labour on a scale, then that's really not going to happen. And all of that then creates the situation where farmers are constrained by markets, and they have to sustain their own economic viability. And in doing so, they sort of end up reproducing aspects of capitalism and transforming other aspects, particularly through the development of these new markets. And you also get certain dynamics of accumulation going on. Ultimately, then, what kind of happens is the narrative of autonomy. The word autonomy isn't actually used itself very frequently, but the kind of autonomy that sits behind these narratives is really one about self-control over sort of our particular farm or our particular area, versus an idea of social control over structural processes. This is a logo just on the left, is kind of Genuino Clandestino is a movement, I suppose you can say, in Italy. It's quite marginal in Calabria. It has a little bit of sort of a presence, but this is kind of a good example of the presentation of resistance as we are a group of small farmers producing and transforming or processing our food products and then marketing them in ways which don't conform to government regulations. And at the same time, there's a sort of a pride in doing it underneath the radar of the state, or in a sort of spirit of non-conformance or non-compliance. But at the same time, it's really about access to markets. It's about saying, I have a right to sell these products. Ultimately, however, you get this kind of autonomy really as a sort of, it's never an outside, it's always an inside position. And that's something which farmers themselves recognise, but also which comes from the sort of philosophical discussions about relational autonomy, which I mentioned earlier. In this picture here, you have J.K. Gibson Graham's iceberg image, which sort of emphasises the kind of non-capitalist processes which are attached to capitalist processes as well, within the sort of same iceberg metaphor, I suppose. But then I've just put a couple of quotes there from farmers to show how they recognise that sort of simultaneous inside-outside position from the system. So one farmer in Italy says, to not have relations with the mafia, to not have relations with the state, but it's obvious we're not extremists in the sense that we're in society, we have to stay there. It's not that we're going to live at the top of a mountain. And then a farmer from Cornwall says, you can't only take from capitalist society what you choose, you're either in it or you're not, but loads of small farmers have to, balance that dilemma. And just before moving on, I forgot to mention actually that in Calabria as well, you also do deal with the mafia, and that really changes the kind of dynamics of autonomy quite considerably. Because if you think going back to this image, in Calabria, you have the mafia sort of overlays that again as another set of institutions, another set of structures which farmers are struggling for autonomy from. And there's, I didn't really want to talk about this in great detail, perhaps we can discuss later, but you get this idea that historically the mafia has hindered the ability of states and markets to come to dominate the Calabrian countryside. So in a way, it's been a historical form of resistance. Although there's sort of problems with that interpretation, it's really, Mafia was always a sort of ruling class, I suppose, in the region. But then more recently, the 'Ndrangheta, which is the Mafia in Calabria, and it's difficult to underemphasize how serious an issue this is. The 'Ndrangheta is, I think it's the largest organized criminal group within Europe, if not the world, or something, in terms of its financial power. But increasingly, there's a narrative that it's incorporated into the market, and so there's this idea that supermarkets in Calabria are controlled by the Mafia. So the struggle for resistance, the struggle for autonomy from markets and from Mafia kind of coincide in a way in that respect. Before finishing, I just sort of shift and talk a little bit about organic certification as a specific example of some of the dynamics when talking about autonomy. So organic certification in principle is sort of something which is about accepting more natural constraints on how farming is done. But in practice, the certification process really involves a kind of voluntary subordination to an external institution. So you're sort of saying, I'm not going to make this set of decisions, but this external body can do so. And it's important to emphasize that it's an institutional mechanism. It's not a mechanism grounded in personal relations. So you often get this how do I say this, contrast. Farmers see this contrast in saying, I don't need to be certified organic because the people I sell to, I know them, or they're very local, or they can come and visit my farm. So that's the more sort of personal relationship, whereas the certified organic is much more impersonal kind of a certification. Even though the certification is fundamentally about markets, it's still mobilized against the market as a kind of, distant kind of other. And it's really about sort of creating a sort of sub-market in a way which is somehow insulated from those wider forces. But within this context, you get different sort of perspectives from farmers. You get, very often farmers will be opposed to specific rules within the organic certification process. They'll disagree with a lot of aspects, but they'll sort of accept on balance the value of subjecting themselves to this. For new farmers, the certification process is interesting because it creates a process of learning about all of the different aspects of more ecological forms of farming. It interestingly allows farms to resolve internal disagreements, and I think there is a couple of some farming couples use it in this way, but also particularly one intentional community in Cornwall collectively would agree to be certified and to subject themselves to that, but then that provided a framework whereby internal disputes within the community could almost be sort of referenced, use organic certification as a reference. However, more generally, probably the most common comment I received, particularly in England, is that in Cornwall, was that the certification process is very costly and too costly for small farms. By contrast, what was very common in Calabria is no one really had a lot of trust in the system. Everyone sort of said, you're paying the person who certifies you, therefore they have no interest whatsoever in rejecting. So there's not really any reason for them to come and deny you certification. So we can't necessarily put a lot of faith in it. And then just to explore some of those dynamics, but as well as a few other issues, this is a quote from a farmer in Cornwall. So she's a woman whose partner works off farm, so she's the one who's sort of responsible for all the farming. She says, I think my partner is more committed to organic farming because he experiences less of the difficulties of that on a day-to-day basis. I applaud him for his commitment to organic farming, but it's very arduous at times to carry that out. And perhaps I'm also more involved with my farming neighbours, some of whom are not organic. And so I see my non-organic neighbours and their farming practice, some of which is rubbish, but I see them perhaps finding an easier way through than me because I've got to, jump through all the organic hoops. And so this sort of draws out a couple of really interesting themes from my research. One, you've got the kind of intra-household bargaining, which goes on over how farm practice is done, and that's really important to reveal that autonomy is particularly if we look at it from the perspective of individuals, is often not evenly distributed within farming households. So in this case, you've got a farmer who works off the farm, but still has a big say in how that farming works. And I don't really want to talk too much about, or I don't want to get into detail now about sort of some of the gender issues, but you do have those dynamics where very often a sort of the male farmer has a more dominant role in sort of, making the final decisions. And so the idea of autonomy within a traditional patriarchal household family is very problematic. But the other thing this draws in is the sort of relationship between farmers and neighbours, and how the socialisation processes that creates changes dynamics of autonomy and changes farmers' desires and wills. And in this case, this should have shifted this woman's perspective perhaps away from organic to sort of see how it can be done outside of an organic certification system. So to sort of move towards a conclusion, a lot of the processes of rural restructuring that are happening in these two regions are both sort of shaping the kinds of autonomy that are emerging, but also sort of constraining it in a number of ways. So at the moment, you've got these processes of revaluing farming resources, an increased desirability of farming, and also the development of new markets. Overall, however, I would say that these kind of confirm Mark's original thesis, that most of these farms are adequately integrated into European capitalism, either because they're able to sell their produce at a premium or because they have access to sort of state subsidies. But there's this sort of problematic group of really the smallest farms who miss out on those subsidies and how they get integrated into some of these processes. If we ask whether there's sort of more radical visions, which a small number of farmers expressed, if these visions can somehow come to the fore and prosper within Europe, it's difficult to see how that can happen. I think it really demands a radical discursive and ideological shift, and really it depends on finding new ways of relating land and labour together. I don't think the sort of small household farm is really going to make any radical changes in these regional contexts. But also at the same time, we're going to be seeing big policy changes in the coming years, particularly with Brexit, and potential sort of for radical neoliberalisation of agricultural policy in the UK, could trigger some interesting processes, but I'm not going to speculate what those are now. So just to conclude, you've sort of got this huge diversity of farmers' different perspectives. Autonomy for these farmers is really pragmatic and specific, responding to specific structural constraints. So capitalism is changing, but not radically, and it's changing through a whole bunch of people doing their own thing. It's not really any of this kind of expression of conscious control or that kind of idea of autonomy as being able to control the structural conditions that we face. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.